Hi, if this is your first visit to my channel, welcome. If you're a returning viewer, thanks for coming back. Today I want to talk about the EtherCAT fieldbus, which is the preferred fieldbus or network to use with our range of controllers. All of the controllers that support EtherCAT run under Codesys, or what is known as uOS within Weidmuller. As you can see from the images at the top left there, I have a UC20WL2000. That is our original controller, and across to the right bottom we have an IoT gateway. If you notice, both have two Ethernet ports. The UR20 has the ability to have local I/O added. The IoT GTW gateway has a very limited amount of I/O accessible here. The intention really is that you would connect it to a external fieldbus. So the related hardware, as of January 25, we have 3 controllers and 2 gateways. So we have the UC20 you've just seen, and there is an M3000 and an M4000 more powerful controllers, all using the same I/O platform. Then we have 2 gateways. We have an IoT GW30, which has the 2 Ethernet ports, and then we have the same again, but with the additional 4G EU. In other words, 4G signal to suit European frequencies. We do have other units to suit America, for example, so you obviously have to insert a SIM card into that. So these will act as EtherCAT masters. So the related software we'd be using would be Codesys Development Software 3.5 SP18 or higher. You also need to install what is called Codesys Control SL runtime onto the actual physical hardware, the controller or gateway. And you also need to add Codesys Control SL into the Codesys development software. That basically imports the physical hardware into Codesys so you can configure it. When you download Codesys from the Codesys website, it will not list any Weidmuller devices until you add that package. I'm also using uOS or Codesys Firmware version 2.13, which is currently the latest. Weidmuller offer 2 UR20 or IP20 fieldbus couplers for EtherCAT. The Eco one is the one shown to the top right here, and you'll notice slight difference in the profile. They do take the same I/O cards. Some of the main differences are the original unit, the one at the bottom left, the FBC EC, has an additional X3 service port, USB Mini B. The Eco doesn't. You'll also notice the standard unit has 2 power connections, one for 24 volt to feed the input cards and the actual coupler itself, and then a second bank of up to 24 that feeds your output cards. On the Eco coupler you just have one connector feeding everything, so you can't differentiate. There are other differences, but this video is not really talking about the difference between these 2 units. It's more of a generic video explaining EtherCAT use within the Weidmuller world. With EtherCAT, when you want to use this with when you want to use the UR20 with our controllers or gateways, there's a few things you need to check. First decision you need to make is, am I going to use the standard coupler or the Eco coupler? So to be honest, quite often you'd probably find the Eco coupler was adequate. The biggest choice is probably down to how many I/O cards you need to fit. You also need to check the coupler firmware version. It may be that you bought the latest product and you would expect it to have the latest firmware, but it's always worth checking on the website, see if there is a later one, and you can download it from there. I'll explain that later and show you where to look. There's also what we call an ESI file. EtherCAT sub-device information file. So you need to check and download the appropriate one for your coupler, the Eco coupler or standard coupler. And then this standard coupler actually has two hardware versions, hardware version 1, hardware version 2. Again, I'll explain that in more detail in a moment. You should also always double check the firmware release notes, and you should also check the supported modules document. So this relates to each individual coupler, and it will tell you what I/O modules and intelligent modules that coupler supports. The last thing you want to do is order couplers and I/O modules and then find that they don't go together. So always check the supported modules, because not all I/O modules will work with the EtherCAT coupler. In this diagram, I'm showing a simple EtherCAT fieldbus system, and you'll notice at the top left there is the controller. I know the images all look the same, the devices do look the same. So the top left device is the controller, and notice I'm using port X2. The X2, the bottom port, is optimized for use with EtherCAT, so please always use that with EtherCAT. Unfortunately, Codesys won't force you to use port X2, it will let you use either, so please make a mental note to use X2 from the controller. Then you can come out of a standard Cat5, Cat6 Ethernet cable and go to port X1 of the first remote I/O island, and then X2 out of there to your next island, and so on in a daisy chain format. EtherCAT is quite flexible with topology, but this is a daisy chain network. I'm not going to go into detail explaining all the topologies and how the EtherCAT protocol works. I will show you later. There is a website dedicated to EtherCAT, and there are lots of YouTube videos that go into the detailed technicalities of EtherCAT. This is not what this video is for. What I would make a note of saying though is that you do not use switches on the EtherCAT network. This is because switches will actually introduce latency into the system and slow things down and can cause problems, so really don't use switches on the EtherCAT side. If you've got other devices such as a HMI or remote I/O or a variable speed drive or a soft start that are connected on, say, Modbus TCP, then I would suggest you come out of port X1 of the controller, and then you can use standard Modbus TCP or Profinet, etc., and use the appropriate switches as you would use with those networks. You can then use port X1 also to connect to your local site router, and that site router then gives you access to the public internet. Because if you're making use of cloud-based services, your login data, publishing it to the cloud or connecting to APIs, you need permanent public internet connection, so that X1 should be reserved for that, so bear that in mind. I've now explained the basics of EtherCAT, so we'll now go into a bit more detail of where you find information on the website related to the couplers. You can go directly to our website if you know where you're looking, or if you're not familiar with Weidmuller websites, then just type in the order number of the product or article number or the text description. Either will do here, and then hopefully you'll see these two hits. You've got the Weidmuller commercial site called the eShop, and you've got the catalog.weidmuller site. It might say it's in German, but because it's in the UK, it will automatically flip to English because you're based in the UK. So personal preference is the product catalog site, so I'm going to click on there, and there you go. There's a photograph of the standard EtherCAT coupler, and if you scroll down here, the most important area I would suggest is downloads. You go into downloads here, you've got lots of certificates, declarations of conformity, approvals, etc. But the important ones for this video are firmware and device description files, the ESI files. So just to explain a bit more about ESI files, They're very much the same as EDS files you'd see with DeviceNet or Ethernet IP or GDS files you see with Profinet. It's exactly the same sort of principle. It defines the functionality of the coupler and the associated modules. And they do change over time. Things develop because we bring out a new I/O module, so we then have to create a new ESI file. So just to explain a bit more with this coupler, this is the standard coupler, and there have actually been two hardware versions. Unfortunately, the part number hasn't changed, but if you look down here at downloads, you've got firmware for hardware version 1, firmware for hardware version 2, and then you've got ESI files for hardware version 1 and hardware version 2. So the simple way to check that is to actually look at the packaging that the coupler came in, and it would actually say HW1 or HW2. I would suggest today everything's HW2 because that's the newer one. HW1 is probably, I'm guessing, 4 or 5 years old. So just be aware that when you download the firmware and ESI files, you download it for your coupler. So in my example, I have got an EtherCAT coupler version 1. It's quite an old one. Just to show you, you've got archive firmware and current firmware. So obviously I want the latest. So I'll click on there, download it, and then the ESI files again. I want the current ESI files for hardware version 1. If you bought new kit, as I've just said, you'll probably want current firmware for hardware 2, current ESI for hardware 2, but again, always check the packaging. The important point to mention here about firmware is that at this point in time, it is not possible to update the firmware of any modules while it's connected to a controller or gateway. What this means is you actually need to, if you need to update the firmware of any I/O modules, you need to connect them to a coupler. For example, the standard coupler you could connect to over USB, and then you could update, change the firmware as needed. So the firmware lives inside the coupler or the I/O module. So there's firmware for the coupler, there's firmware for the I/O modules, and the ESI file is a file you need to import into Codesys. I'll explain that in a later video. Okay, so once you've downloaded your firmware and ESI file, you can click into the zip file of the ESI, and within it you'll see this file. So what you really want to do here is extract this information to a folder on your PC. And then here you've got the EtherCAT coupler firmware itself. Put them somewhere safe because you're going to need them later. I didn't want to make this video too long, so this video is finished now. That covers where you find ESI files, the very basics of EtherCAT. The next video in this series will be how you then import the ESI files into Codesys and create a project. So that will be the next video. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like and subscribe. Hit the subscribe button to keep you informed of my new videos. I will put some links in the description to the EtherCAT website and also some additional YouTube videos that go into more detail on EtherCAT. Thanks for watching.